going back to your academic life at Loughborough, you are one of the founding members of the Discourse and Rhetoric Group, which celebrates its 30th anniversary actually this year.
Yeah.
So what do you remember from those early days? How did that all start?
I remember it started in the sense that I came in and there was already a cluster of people who've been involved with the writing of the Ideological Dilemmas book. And of course that was Michael Billig and Mike Gain, Derek Edwards, Alan Radley was part of it at that time, David Middleton. And then when I arrived, Alan said that he wanted to move on and do other things, and Susan Condor, who had been there, she moved back to, because she was on secondment and so on, she moved back to Lancaster. And we decided that we wanted some kind of group like that, and we met in Nick's office. And the first meeting there was Mick Billig, Derek Edwards, David Middleton, Mike Gain, myself, and Ros Gill and Nigel Edley, the two postgraduates. And there was, it must have been a year when we could meet in Mick's office. But we typically did do a recognisable thing. We had some materials, a piece of interview we talked about, interpretive repertoires. We did something which thought about ideology in relation to practice, or something like that.
So you've seen DARG evolve quite a bit over the years. Do you have any memorable sessions that you attended?
I was trying to think about that. I worked out how many I've been to, and I think it must be something in the order of 700, because it was it was very regular, and so it's hard to pick out individual ones. It's the overall texture of things. It did evolve with different phases, which are quite distinctive. And we had some passionate arguments about things. Maybe my fading memory can't remember precisely what those were about. And there were, if I was trying to think of the early days, and it might be Mike Gain, who of course was a sociologist and wrote the kind of ideology chapter for Ideological Dilemmas. He would make some general claim about the data, and I'd say, well, what line is this on? And we would do that. So I think that's doesn't do justice at all to the early years, but there was a bit of that. And of course, it changed with the coming and going of PhD students. We had some brilliant PhD students. Anna Dempsey very early on, like in 89 or something like that, Belinda Place, and people who have now disappeared and gone off. But and then there was still, Andy McKinley was still working with me as a PhD student, and Liz Barrett came down from St Andrews and did work as well. And then Andy's still, he's dean at Edinburgh. Liz Barrett does something in personnel at Ford in a very energetic way. So those kind of things made a difference.
You mentioned your close collaboration with Derek Edwards. Can you tell us a bit more about that, how it started and how it worked?
It started in the sense that it was a kind of serious bromance, I think. We really hit it off intellectually. And I stayed in his house on and off when I first arrived, before I'd actually taken up residence in Loughborough, because there was a bit of transition issue moving down from Scotland. And we just found that we'd got so much to talk about. And this reflects academia and what it was like in 1988, 89. We would go out for a lunch in a pub somewhere in Loughborough or the surrounding countryside and spend 3 hours talking about some issues in attribution theory or some piece of data. He was a very fast worker. We collected materials as they were at hand, and immediately started doing things with them. And so he'd write a draft of something and I'd write another draft, and we would, almost by accident, we started publishing stuff. And it really affected my thinking. I mean, I'd been very involved with the intellectual rigour of Margaret Weatherall, and she was a brilliant scholar and academic. And Derek kind of added to that with a different kind of context, his take coming in from developmental psychology and his linguistic skills. And we had an enormously intense intellectual relationship. And there were kind of 4 years where it felt like it was just one conversation that was just interrupted by a bit of sleep or kind of having to teach or something like that. And that, was carried on long after. But that time was so intensive. When we were writing the paper for Psych Review, for example, where we were engaging with a number of other bodies of work and trying to develop what would we really say to proper cognitive psychologists. And we just worked and worked and worked at getting that right. And it kind of paid off. And I'm not sure that I've ever quite had an intellectually intense period as those years.
At some point at Loughborough, you took on a more managerial position as the Dean of the School of Social, Political and Geographical Sciences. How did that change your daily research routine?
I took that on for two reasons. One is that Steve Reicher, who's a close friend, and I'd spent a little bit of time with him in Scotland, and he'd been chair of psychology in St Andrews, where of course I started my degree for 3 years, and he was saying that he felt that it was important at some point in your career to put something back like that. And he's someone I respect a lot, and it was interesting. And then I was persuaded that I was the person who was best placed to transition the department. So initially it was head of department, and so I was kind of pushed into it. And then almost immediately, and this was the really big change, the government changed to the Tory government, and student fees, which had been £3,000, were tripled to £9,000, producing a huge load on students, very difficult environment for recruiting students. And then the world financial crisis happened. I think the conversation I was having about being head of department was like in the week that Lehman Brothers failed. And so my time was immediately crisis management. And I found that interesting. And I got quite involved. I was very passionate about doing the job well and being, looking after scholars that I cared about. And I'm not sure I did a brilliant job of that, but that was certainly the focus. And it was very hard to really focus with the intensity required on scholarship. So it certainly knocked back and cut back on what I was doing. Something like DARG was nice because I could come and be involved a bit once a week, but even then I missed a lot of those meetings because of the culture.
In 2015, you took on a new position, this time as the Dean for the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University in the States.
Yeah.
How does that compare to your previous position?
It's extraordinarily different. American academia is very different. Communication as a discipline doesn't exist like that in the UK. Communication in North America is a mixture of social psychology, leadership, organisational change, and often has media stuff in it. So the school I'm in has journalism and media studies, communication, and library and information science, all of which I think are very interesting and go together very well. And so there, I was immediately thinking through that set of disciplines and how important those collection of ideas are for shaping future challenges in health, in the way politics works, in the way new media is transforming old media and so on, and the really big political and social effects of that. And so I was very excited about that possibility, the move to North America at a time. I have to say that going to North America when Obama was president was rather wonderful, and one of the most extraordinary experiences of my first year there was being on stage with Obama when he gave the presidential address for the graduating students in this huge stadium with thousands and thousands of people. You know, it was sold out, as you can imagine, with parents and graduating students. And Obama, his description of Rutgers was "America converges here." I have the badge that the university produced because Rutgers is a very, very diverse, probably the most diverse of the R1, the research-intensive universities in North America, and a very high proportion of our students' parents were immigrants or had not had any higher education, and that is very different from Loughborough. And it's a very interesting, humbling in some ways, exciting in other ways experience to be part of that. Very exciting.
If you look back at the projects you've been involved in, the research you've done, is there a particular, or maybe several particular projects or pieces of research that you're particularly fond of?
I think it's a bit like talking about your children, you know, it's a bit bad to say you like one more than another. And some of it, I think, is part of the broader programmatics, the kind of broader vision that I'm fond of. I think that collection of papers that make up discursive psychology, I was very pleased with how that all came together and the intensity of the analysis there, and I still I'm chuffed by it. I look at it and it still does something which is unique, I think. Later on, I guess, the work I did with Sally Wiggins, for example, who was a brilliant postgraduate, and I'd never been interested in food, and she was interested in food and eating disorders, and we compromised in saying, well, let's collect people eating, and we had a very intense kind of engagement with what it would be to look at eating, and so I'm very pleased with what we produced together. I like the paper on food assessments, for example, that we did for the BJSP. I think that is something really interesting, still significant. Obviously, the work with Alexa Hepburn, and I guess the tradition of working on the NSPCC, and that paper we wrote on concerns, which is a very discursive psychological topic in the sense we're looking at the way the word concern, the way the practice of displaying a concern is relevant to the business of calling up a child protection helpline. I think we worked very hard on that, and I'm really pleased by it. I love the thing we did on threats in family mealtimes because it brings together a broader interest in social conflict and those sorts of things. But I'm pretty happy.
looking now in the future and your current and future plans, you did mention that you're working on something. Can you reveal a little bit more about it, or is it very hush-hush?
I don't think there's anything hush-hush. I am involved in a number of ongoing projects in relation to, with Alexa Hepburn on various strands of work, and we've been working with Galina Bolden a lot, and the three of us work together very well, and with Jennifer Mandelbaum as well, who's part of that. So picking up from this very intensive conversation analytic community there is at Rutgers, which is a real privilege to be part of. I think we are interested in socialization, and as a broader issue, rather than the classic psychological perspective, what is socialization from a participant situated perspective? How does one do stuff which influences the future, which changes development? So Alexa and I have been talking for rather a long time now about various elements. So we've looked at directives and requests and threats, all arguably elements of that. And then we've been looking at admonishments and the way in which emotional display comes in, like anger and upset as part of that. So we're interested, and then my current interest is in shame. I'm intrigued by shame because, again, it's a classic sociological, social psychological concept, something that sociologists have looked at and anthropologists as a kind of very big but rather ineffable thing to do with culture and kinship and so on. But Alexa and I were very keen to look at it in terms of the conversational systematics. So how, for example, can a question be asked that generates a relevant piece of shame, if you like, and how is that tied in to a broader project of managing your child's development change? So we're looking at questions like, what did I say? Where someone's just said, don't do that. And then, so it's not like you really want the answer, do you remember that? Rather, you're drawing attention to conduct which from the point of view of a parent is inadequate, from the point of view of a child it's great fun, or whatever, or lovely to be naughty. So looking at the practice of shaming. So there it fits for me this broader issue of looking at socialization and rethinking it, the very specifics that you can use from conversation analysis to unlock that, and to tie it to psychological issues, because shame is traditionally seen as a psychological state, as an emotion. And it's very interesting how Margaret Weatherall and I's trajectories have diverged a bit, but worked in parallel to some extent, in that her very interesting book on emotion has some elements of that in it. And you can see how we started in a very similar place, but I'm interested in that too, but in this very specific located way. So that's one illustration, and it depends a little bit on carving out space in the very intensive day job.
So one final question. Besides the daily work you do in the Dean's office and research, when you find that spare time, what are your favorite pastime activities, hobbies?
Hobbies, pastime. Well, we're living in the tri-state area, kind of in between New York and Philadelphia. So I think for me, the extraordinary possibility of just exploring New York in a very workaday way, actually, just because you can, we're members of the Whitney Museum of Modern Art, which is a wonderful thing, going to galleries like that, but not as a tourist, but as a kind of local just nipping up for dinner to somewhere just, you know, in the Upper East Side and hanging out. I find that really exciting. We go down to the shore and go swimming on the Jersey Shore and have cool coffee down there and that kind of thing. And of course in my job there's lots of things that I never believed that I'd be doing. I mean, I sat on a stage with President Obama. I chatted to Mayor de Blasio of New York and about Gramsci, and that's something I never believed that I would do, and that was pretty interesting. Last week I spent most of the day with Gloria Steinem at her apartment, talking about a kind of joint project for doing something in Rutgers, preparing for the appointment of the Steinem Chair, which is a project that we've been generating money for some time, which will be a chair involved with feminism in the media at a time when that is so important to look at. Those are so exciting, and the community of people that I've met, alums from Rutgers all over North America, people, you know, I met someone in San Francisco who graduated in 1963, who set up one of the first computer-based card index systems for the library in San Francisco. And her story is like a 20th century story. It's got issues to do with gender inequality and oppression, it's got issues to do with new technology, it's got issues to do with, you know, her moving from Toronto across Canada down, and she was enormously influenced by her 2 years at Rutgers, and there's something very moving about being part of something where you can see people's trajectory. In Britain we're very poor, I think, at following our students through, of seeing them as a community who are part of your family, part of your responsibility. And so that has been fantastic.
Thank you, that sounds wonderful. Thank you very much for a great interview.
It was a pleasure.
And an inspiring account of
Thank you.
Discourse and Rhetoric Group.
Excellent.